So I'm going to talk about I'm adopting what we call a global Englishist perspective on the English language. The title of my talk contains two really key words that underpin the research that I do in English language and English language teaching. And that is superdiversity, which is a word that really characterizes the way English is used around the world today, and the context in which English is spoken. And then transcultural, which is a fairly new term that we are using in applied linguistics to talk about the way in which communication and culture combine together when we are using language. The key point here is that as English is spoken, it is being reshaped during interaction. Okay? And there are several ways in which that reshaping occurs. Traditionally, we talk about language varieties, and we talk about how language becomes established as representative of a particular speech community. And we can talk about different varieties of English. We can talk about British English, American English. We can talk, also more recently, we've been able to talk about Indian English, Nigerian English, and so on, to represent how English has changed or is still changing in the different contexts that it's used worldwide. We can talk about what happens to English during interactions, particularly what happens to English during interactions where there are speakers from many different language backgrounds present. In multilingual and multicultural contexts of use, the way in which English develops, the way in which English changes is much more fluid and much more dynamic. And that's key to what I'm going to talk about today. The dynamism and the fluidity inherent in all languages, but very particularly on display in English when it is used as a lingua franca. So, what I'm going to talk about now is superdiversity. You know? How many languages are there in the world? How diverse is the world, linguistically speaking? The answer depends on many things. The Ethnologue, which is a database of world languages, it includes 7,102 languages as recognized as languages in the world. This is a map of all of the languages of the world that I've taken from the Ethnologue database. Each red point on the map represents what has been identified in the database as the geographical center of that language. Excuse me, and again, what you notice here is very uneven distribution of languages. There are large parts of the world that are apparently not so linguistically diverse as others. How does this relate to English? Well, this is important to think about from the context of looking at English worldwide, because what it means is English is increasingly being spoken in contexts that are fundamentally multilingual and multicultural. What we're going to really look at is the status of English globally and how this status means that the language is coming into contact with many other languages and what influence those other languages are having on English. So understanding the status of English worldwide really is something that we can look at from two different perspectives. And there are two key paradigms that have looked at the status of English worldwide. You have what's called the World Englishist paradigm, and this focuses on nativized varieties of English. So it focuses on what would be described as post-colonial varieties of English, Singaporean English, Indian English, Nigerian English, and so on. And then you have the global Englishist paradigm, where the focus is much more on deterritorialized or non-territorialized uses of English. Here we're talking about transcending conventional language and culture boundaries. Transcultural communication, this is rethinking intercultural communication. So conventionally, we talk about interaction between speakers from different first language backgrounds as intercultural communication. More recently, we've changed the prefix from inter to trans. So intercultural, as in international, suggests that it's something that happens between languages and between cultures. Okay? But because of this superdiversity, what we've realized is that people aren't just moving between languages and cultures, they're blending them together. And what we found is that key to successful intercultural communication is being flexible with language and being able to do what we call accommodation strategies. It takes a long time to say English as a lingua franca, so we use the acronym ELF. Okay, so what is ELF? ELF is essentially, it can be defined in several ways. It can be defined as a context or a setting. So an ELF setting is any setting where English is the preferred choice of communication in a multilingual context. So speakers from different language backgrounds are using English to interact with each other. Right? So we know that language and communication are, I've said this several times, very dynamic and very fluid. Well, the more dynamic and fluid you can be when you speak a language, often the more successful you are in interaction, the more successfully you can communicate. But the way we orient to language in education is very, very different from that. There's quite a distance between the linguistic dynamism that we see on display in speech and the way we codify language in dictionaries and grammars and the way we select norms for language teaching. What is ELF? Definition of ELF provided by Barbara Seidelhofer, is one of the leading researchers in this field, and she says this: ELF is any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice and often the only option. Or the University of Southampton website, which has a Centre for Global English's research, says this: English as it is used as a contact language among speakers from first languages. So very simple definitions of what it is. Incorporating an ELF perspective in classrooms, however, requires practitioner-oriented research to re-examine current methodologies and consider how we could develop materials and methods that would be more in line with the way English is being spoken around the world. An ELF orientation to language, if we can adopt one, might look something like this. It might mean spending proportionately less time teaching native speaker norms that are not widely used in other English language varieties or other communicative contexts. That doesn't mean not teaching native speaker norms. It means spending proportionately less time teaching those norms, focusing on those norms. Okay, thank you for listening. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for teachers to come together and share ideas with each other, and also to hear all of the presentations, particularly the keynote presentations, which should hopefully be quite thought-provoking for the teachers and allow them to go back to their classrooms and rethink what it is they're doing in their classrooms, to try to connect with new ideas for teaching, new ideas about language, and to try to see this as an opportunity for professional development. I think coming as a teacher, coming to a conference like this is a very valuable experience.